They teach you about the First Crusade, the blood, the glory, the conquest of Jerusalem. They glorify the Third. Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, kings and legends locked in battle. But the Second Crusade? They skip it. They gloss over it. A sentence. A footnote. As if it never really happened. But it did. And what happened changed everything. It was a disaster. Not just a military failure, but a political, religious, and moral collapse so catastrophic, it threatened to destroy the very idea of crusading. It exposed hypocrisy, greed, betrayal, and worst of all, it revealed a truth the Church couldn't allow to survive. This is the real reason the Second Crusade was buried in silence. It all began in 1144. The city of Edessa, one of the first Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land, fell to the Muslim general Imad ad-Din Zengi. It sent shockwaves through Christendom. Edessa wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, the first Crusader state. The Church declared it a catastrophe that demanded divine retribution. So Pope Eugenius III, backed by Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful preacher of his age, called for a new crusade, a Second Crusade. But unlike the first, which had been led by nobles and warlords, this time kings would march. Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, two Christian monarchs with massive armies, thousands of knights, tens of thousands of foot soldiers. This wasn't just a religious campaign, it was a display of European power. But from the beginning, something felt wrong. The Pope claimed this was God's will, but many whispered it was about power, about pride, about land. The first sign came when Louis and Conrad began marching, separately. They were meant to be allies, but their egos wouldn't allow it. Each king wanted to reach glory on his own. Each blamed the other when supplies ran short, when men died of thirst, when ambushes by Turkish forces slaughtered entire battalions in Anatolia. Conrad's army was nearly destroyed before even reaching the Holy Land. Louis's was reduced to a fraction. By the time they arrived in Jerusalem, their numbers had been decimated. Morale was shattered. But then came the decision, the one that would doom the crusade entirely. Instead of trying to retake Edessa, the original reason for the crusade, the Crusader leadership made a different choice. They attacked Damascus. Yes, Damascus. A Muslim city, yes, but one that had, at the time, been relatively neutral. In fact, the rulers of Damascus had even cooperated with the Crusader states against other Muslim factions. It was a strategic city, wealthy, beautiful, a prize, but not the target the people had been told was divinely ordained. And so, the Second Crusade became a campaign not of liberation, but of opportunism. The siege of Damascus in 1148 was a disaster, a catastrophic failure of strategy, trust, and honor. The Crusaders turned on each other. Local commanders betrayed one another to gain favor. Arab defenders held the walls, and within just 4 days, the mighty Crusader forces were forced to retreat in disgrace. The humiliation was total. The people of Europe were outraged. The Church was silent. And here's where the erasure begins. Because what followed wasn't merely a military failure, it was a crisis of faith. Crusaders returned home not as heroes, but as broken men. Disillusioned, angry, and they spoke. They told of leaders who lied, of kings who bickered, of clergy who promised heaven but delivered hell. Rumors spread that the entire campaign had been a front for political land grabs, that the Church had used divine rhetoric to justify theft and slaughter, that the holy men guiding the crusade were more interested in gold than God. And in France, Bernard of Clairvaux, once the voice of the crusade, was confronted by crowds demanding answers. He tried to defend the mission, but the anger was too great. He retreated in shame, his reputation forever stained. The Church made a choice. They rewrote the story. They reframed the crusade as a minor setback, a tragic footnote. Edessa was never retaken, and Damascus never fell, but those facts were swept aside. History books moved quickly to the more romantic Third Crusade, skipping over the rot and scandal of the Second. And over time, the memory faded. But there's more, because buried in a 13th century manuscript found in the Vatican archives, Hidden in a section long thought unrelated to the Crusades was a letter and signed, addressed to a cardinal. The writer, possibly a knight, describes in detail how bribes were exchanged between Crusader generals and local Muslim warlords during the siege, how sacred relics were looted from Christian villages to fund the war, and how several miracles reported during the journey, used to rally troops, had been fabricated by clerics under orders from Rome. This wasn't just failure, it was fraud. And here's the part that chills the bones. The letter ends with a warning. If these truths ever reach the pulpit, they will burn the faith faster than any enemy sword. So the church did what it had to do. Erase, silence, rewrite. They promoted the legends of the First Crusade. Heroic knights, divine signs, victory. They elevated the Third Crusade, kings clashing with noble foes. But the second was locked away. It didn't fit the narrative. A crusade not for faith but for power, not against evil but for greed, led not by visionaries, but by politicians and cowards. A crusade where the only thing conquered was the illusion of righteousness. And that's why it vanished. But erasure does not mean it didn't happen. The ghosts of the Second Crusade remain, hidden in overlooked manuscripts, in letters tucked into monastery walls, in the crumbling ruins of siege camps outside Damascus. And they tell a story far darker than anything you've been taught. Because the real danger of history isn't what's told, it's what's left out. And when entire wars are erased, we must ask why. Perhaps it's because they show us too much of ourselves. Petty, divided, willing to cloak ambition in the veil of holiness. Or maybe it's because in that forgotten crusade, we see the failure not of swords or kings, but of the very idea that violence could ever be sacred. They erased the Second Crusade from books, but the silence it left behind speaks louder than any history ever written.